Story number 1.
The house on Maplewood Drive had always been a place where families came and went, generations raised children, and neighbors waved from their porches. To anyone driving by, it was just another suburban home nestled among others with perfectly mowed lawns and tidy flower beds. But for the Harris family, the house was the beginning of a nightmare they never expected. The Harrises moved in on a warm summer day in July. It was their first home after years of renting cramped apartments in the city. Sarah Harris was thrilled to have a backyard for her two children, Alex and Emma, while her husband David looked forward to his daily jogs along the tree-lined sidewalks. The house was exactly what they had hoped for, a 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom with a garage and a basement that David wanted to turn into a workshop. The first few weeks were uneventful. The kids explored the neighborhood, making new friends, and the couple settled into their routines. But as summer faded into early fall, subtle changes began to unsettle Sarah. It started with the sounds, soft knocks and creaks echoing through the quiet house late at night. Sarah initially dismissed them as typical house noises, old pipes contracting, wood settling, but then the knocking grew more rhythmic, deliberate, often coming from the basement walls or behind closed doors. One night, Sarah awoke to the sound of whispers so faint she wasn't sure she was imagining them. They came from the hallway outside her bedroom. She strained to listen, but the voices dissolved into silence. When she asked David about it in the morning, he shrugged it off as stress from work. A few days later, Emma came to Sarah sobbing, claiming she had seen a man standing in the hallway outside her room. He was wearing old clothes and his face was all blurry, Emma told her mother, eyes wide with fear. Sarah forced a smile, assuring her it was just a bad dream, but inside, unease began to bloom. David, too, had his own strange experiences. One evening, while working in the basement, he felt a sudden chill despite the heater running. His flashlight flickered, and for a split second, he saw a shadow dart just beyond the stairwell. When he called Sarah down to look, nothing was there. One weekend, the family decided to have a garage sale. Neighbors stopped by, chatting and buying trinkets, but one elderly woman lingered longer than usual. She introduced herself as Mrs. Langley, a longtime resident of the neighborhood. "Ah, the old Harris place," she said, her eyes clouding over. "You know, this house has a bit of a history, something that unsettled the last family who lived here." Sarah leaned in. "What happened?" Mrs. Langley sighed. "There was a man who lived here in the 60s, James Whitaker. He was a recluse, mostly kept to himself. Some say he was a kind man, others say he had a temper. His wife left him, and the neighbors heard yelling late into the night. One day, he disappeared. No one knows where he went. After that, strange things started happening in the house." David raised an eyebrow. "What kind of strange things?" "Objects moving on their own, doors slamming, shadows seen in the windows, and some said they heard music playing, old piano melodies, though no one lived here with a piano." Sarah thanked Mrs. Langley, but the seed of doubt had been planted. That night, as the family settled down, the atmosphere shifted. The air felt heavier, colder. Sarah sat in the living room reading when she heard the unmistakable sound of piano keys playing somewhere in the house. She paused, heart pounding, then got up and followed the music to the basement door. But when she opened it, there was nothing there, only darkness and silence. The incidents escalated. Emma's drawings, once colorful and cheerful, became dark and unsettling. Figures with hollow eyes, long fingers reaching out of doorways. Alex complained of nightmares where a man watched him from the corner of the room. David found scratches on the basement stairs, deep and jagged, as if something had tried to claw its way out. One afternoon, Sarah was cleaning the attic when she found an old trunk tucked away under a dusty tarp. Inside were yellowed letters and photographs belonging to James Whitaker. The letters revealed a troubled man, tormented by loneliness and loss. The final letter hinted at a desperate act, a plea for forgiveness to his estranged wife, and a wish to be remembered. That night, the house seemed to come alive. The piano music returned, louder and more insistent. Doors slammed throughout the house, lights flickered, and the temperature plunged. The family huddled together as a dark shadow moved swiftly across the walls, vanishing into the corners. Desperate, they reached out to a local paranormal expert who confirmed their suspicions. The house was haunted by James Whittaker's restless spirit, trapped by unresolved pain and anger. With the expert's help, the family performed a cleansing ritual, reading the letters aloud and offering forgiveness. Slowly, the presence began to fade. The piano music stopped, the shadows receded, and warmth returned to the house. Years later, the Harrises still live on Maplewood Drive, and though the memories linger, the house is now a place of peace. But sometimes, when the wind is just right, neighbors say you can hear faint piano notes drifting through the night. Story the end.
Story number 2.
I remember the first time I saw the house on Evergreen Lane. It was the kind of place people dream about when they think of quiet suburban life. 2 stories with a wraparound porch, ivy crawling up the brick walls, and a neatly kept garden in the front yard. When I bought it, I thought I was finally escaping the relentless chaos of city life. I was ready for peace, for routine, for a fresh start. The neighborhood was exactly as I hoped. Friendly faces, kids playing in the streets, neighbors waving as they passed by. But from the moment I moved in, subtle things began to unsettle me, though I couldn't quite put my finger on why. The first few days, I chalked up the unease to typical moving jitters. The house was old, built in the early 1950s, and creaked and groaned like an ancient ship. But some noises didn't feel natural. Doors closed softly but without a breeze. Footsteps echoed when I was alone. The air would chill suddenly in a way that no heater could explain. One evening, about a week after moving in, I was sitting in the living room reading when the lights flickered violently before plunging the room into darkness. I reached for my phone to use as a flashlight and felt a presence, like something was watching me from the hallway. My breath caught in my throat, and I could barely move as a cold draft brushed past me. The lights snapped back on, but the room felt hollow, empty of warmth. I told myself it was just stress. Over the next few weeks, the incidents grew more frequent. I found objects moved, books off shelves, kitchen knives out of place. Once I woke up to the sound of soft, muffled crying, but when I searched the house, no one was there. I began sleeping with a lamp on, afraid to be alone in the dark. One night, as I was heading to bed, I saw her. A little girl standing at the foot of the stairs. She was translucent, pale as moonlight, with tangled dark hair falling across her face. Her eyes were wide, filled with sorrow. She stared at me for a long moment and then vanished. I was too terrified to scream. The next day, I tried to research the house. The town library had old records, and I found a small news clipping from the early 1960s about a girl named Sarah who had lived in the house. She was 8 years old and had died in the home under mysterious circumstances. The report was vague, mentioning an accident, but nothing conclusive. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. At night, I would sometimes hear Sarah's voice whispering my name, barely audible, as if she was calling from far away. The feeling of sadness that hung in the house was crushing. I found myself talking to her, asking what she wanted, why she was still here. One evening, I found a small, hand-drawn picture tucked under the couch cushion, a child's drawing of the house with a stick figure standing outside, but one window was blacked out as if something was hiding inside. I showed the drawing to Mrs. Jenkins, an elderly neighbor who had lived on Evergreen Lane for decades. Her face paled when she saw it. "That's Sarah's window," she said quietly. "They say she was never really gone." Her words lingered in my mind. Things took a darker turn. Doors slammed shut on their own, lights blinked erratically, and I was often awakened by pounding noises from the basement. One night, the basement door creaked open slowly, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. I felt the cold again, thick and suffocating, and something whispered, "Find me." I gathered my courage and ventured downstairs the next day. The basement was cluttered with old furniture covered in dust and cobwebs. Near the back wall, I noticed a loose floorboard. Beneath it was a small wooden box, locked but fragile with age. I pried it open and found a faded diary. The diary belonged to Sarah. In it, she wrote about a man who visited the house frequently, someone she was terrified of. Her entries described fear, silence, and feeling trapped. The last entry was hurried and ended mid-sentence. Reading it sent a shiver down my spine. I contacted a paranormal investigator who agreed to come to the house. That night, as she conducted her session, the atmosphere became electric. The investigator claimed to sense a malevolent presence, something darker than Sarah herself. She suggested that Sarah's spirit was trapped, but also that something else had latched on, a shadow feeding off the girl's pain. A cleansing ritual was performed, and for a while, the house seemed to breathe easier. The heavy weight lifted, and I slept through the nights without disturbance. But the relief was short-lived. One night, I woke to the sound of frantic scratching on the walls, like claws scraping wood. A cold presence filled the room. I saw shadows twisting and coalescing into a figure, arc darnacing and filled with rage. It screamed wordlessly before vanishing in a gust of cold air. The next day, I found the diary torn apart, pages ripped and strewn across the floor. I knew then that leaving was the only option. I packed my belongings and moved out, selling the house to a young family eager to settle in. Before I left, I took one last look at the porch where Sarah once stood, alone, waiting for someone to set her free. To this day, I still hear faint whispers on quiet nights and sometimes catch a glimpse of a little girl's silhouette at the edge of my vision. Some spirits linger longer than we expect, bound by fear, sadness, or something darker. I hope Sarah finally found peace. I hope the shadows did not. Story the end.
Story number 3.
The neighborhood was everything we wanted when we first moved into that quiet suburban street. Tree-lined sidewalks, neighbors who greeted each other, kids riding their bikes in the afternoon sun. The house was a modest 2-story, with a tidy lawn and a white picket fence, an image straight out of a postcard. It was perfect, or so we thought. My wife Jenna and I had just moved in with our 2 kids, Emma and Noah, hoping to put down roots after years of bouncing from city to city for my job. The kids adapted quickly, making friends in the cul-de-sac, and Jenna loved decorating our new home. But from the moment we stepped in, I had a strange feeling, something I couldn't put my finger on, a lingering unease beneath the surface. The first few nights were restless. Emma, who was 7, complained of bad dreams. She told Jenna she kept seeing a sad woman standing outside her bedroom window. We chalked it up to adjusting to a new environment and dismissed it. One evening, around dusk, I was working late in the study on the first floor when I heard faint knocking coming from the basement door. The basement was unfinished, cold, and mostly used for storage. I ignored it at first, assuming it was the wind, but the knocking persisted, slow, rhythmic, like someone tapping for attention. When I went down to check, the basement was empty except for old boxes and cobwebs. Probably just the pipes, I muttered, though the sound had a human cadence. A few nights later, Jenna woke me, pale and shaken. "I heard crying," she whispered, like a woman crying downstairs. We searched every corner of the house but found nothing. That was when the lights began flickering in odd patterns. Not just the occasional bulb dying, but the overhead lights in the hallway pulsing on and off. At first I thought it was a wiring issue, but an electrician said the system was fine. One afternoon while I was mowing the lawn, a neighbor approached me. Mr. Harding, an elderly man who had lived there for decades, seemed hesitant but wanted to share something. "You know," he said slowly, "this house wasn't always a house. It used to be part of a farm back in the 1800s. A woman lived here, Mary Thornton. She lost her children to illness and went a bit mad after that. Some say her spirit never left." I laughed nervously. "Ghost stories?" He nodded solemnly. "Call them what you want, but people around here say you can still hear her singing on quiet nights." That night, Emma ran into our bedroom crying, telling us the woman outside her window was singing again. We began researching Mary Thornton's story. According to the town archives, Mary had indeed lived in the area, losing her children during a severe epidemic. Grief overwhelmed her, and she was said to have wandered the property at night, singing lullabies. She died alone in the house that once stood where ours now was. Jenna and I started experiencing things ourselves. I often felt cold spots near the stairs, like invisible drafts cutting through the warmth. Jenna heard whispers calling her name, always soft and just beyond comprehension. One evening, the family photos on the mantelpiece tilted suddenly, even though the surface was perfectly level. The children's behavior worsened. Noah, normally outgoing, became withdrawn, often staring at corners and refusing to enter the basement. Emma, terrified of her room, begged to sleep in our bed. One night, the worst happened. We were asleep when I woke to the sound of Emma screaming. Rushing to her room, I found her sitting bolt upright in bed, eyes wide with terror, pointing to the window. Outside, in the dark shadows of the garden, was a faint silhouette of a woman in an old-fashioned dress, standing motionless. I blinked, and she was gone. After that, Jenna insisted we get help. We contacted a local medium named Claire who specialized in restless spirits. When she entered the house, her expression grew serious. "This presence is strong," she said. "She's trapped in sorrow and pain. She means no harm, but she is lost." Claire performed a cleansing ceremony. She lit candles, chanted prayers, and moved slowly through every room. During the ritual, Emma gasped and said, "She's crying. She wants to be heard." Claire explained that Mary's spirit was tethered to her grief and the memories of her lost children. Until those memories were acknowledged, she could not move on. We decided to create a small memorial in the garden, planting flowers and leaving notes to Mary, hoping to give her peace. For weeks afterward, the disturbances gradually lessened. The cold spots faded, the whispering stopped, and the children slept soundly again. One evening, as we sat on the porch, a gentle breeze carried a faint lullaby. Jenna smiled wistfully. "I think she's saying goodbye." The neighborhood returned to its quiet routine, but sometimes when the wind rustles the leaves just right, I swear I hear a soft singing carried from the past, a mother's sorrow lingering in the air. We never spoke much about the haunting after that, but the experience stayed with us, a reminder that even in the calmest places, some stories refuse to be forgotten. Story the end.
Story number 4.
Moving to the suburbs had always been a dream for me. After years of living in cramped city apartments with neighbors above, below, and on all sides, the promise of a quiet street lined with trees and houses spaced just far enough apart was irresistible. When I found the house on Willow Lane, I thought I had finally found a place to call home, a peaceful retreat from the chaos that had followed me for so long. The neighborhood was fairly new, developed on what had once been farmland. Most of the homes were less than 20 years old, built with uniform siding and manicured lawns. Everyone kept their yards tidy, children played on sidewalks, and neighbors greeted each other with nods or waves. I liked the normalcy of it all. The house itself was modest but welcoming. 2 stories, 3 bedrooms, a small backyard fenced in with weathered wood. I had a cat named Whiskers who had adapted quickly to the new environment. The first few days were calm. I unpacked boxes, arranged furniture, and slowly began to settle in. That first night, I woke up around 2 a.m. to the sound of footsteps. At first, I thought it was the house settling, creaks and groans typical of older construction, but the steps were too deliberate and steady to be random noises. Whiskers was alert, her ears pricked, her tail flicking anxiously. I reached for my phone to check the time. Then I heard it again. Steps, pacing outside my bedroom door. They stopped abruptly. I held my breath. The door didn't open. I whispered Whiskers' name, and she jumped into bed, settling close to me. I told myself it was probably a neighbor up late or some street noise, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that something was wrong. Over the next few days, odd things started happening. Lights flickered without explanation. I'd find items moved. My keys left on the kitchen counter would show up in the living room. Doors I was sure I'd locked were sometimes open. Whiskers became more restless, hissing at empty corners or darting toward walls where nothing was visible. One evening, as I was cooking dinner, the kitchen lights dimmed suddenly, plunging the room into a shadowy half-light. I paused, waiting for the bulbs to stabilize. Instead, I heard a whisper, soft, breathy, unintelligible, coming from the hallway. I called out, but only silence answered. I began researching the history of the land and the neighborhood. Old maps showed that the area had been farmland owned by the Gardner family in the early 1900s. A small farmhouse once stood where my house now did, demolished decades before the subdivision was built. The story went that the last resident, a woman named Margaret Gardner, lived there alone after her husband died in World War II. She was said to have gone mad with grief, wandering the fields until she disappeared one winter. No one ever found her body. I shared this with a neighbor, Mr. Whitaker, an elderly man who had lived in the neighborhood since it was first developed. "Ah, the Gardners," he said, eyes clouded with memory. "Folks say Margaret never left. Some say she's still out there, waiting. People have heard crying, although seen lights flickering near the woods at night." I dismissed it as local legend but felt a twinge of unease. One night as I lay in bed, I woke to the faint sound of singing, an old lullaby, soft and haunting, drifting through the window. Whiskers bolted upright, fur bristling. I got up, pulled back the curtain, and looked into the backyard. Moonlight illuminated the grass, but nothing was there. I closed the window, heart pounding. The following days, the manifestations grew more intense. I found muddy footprints on the freshly cleaned floor, though it hadn't rained. Doors slammed shut behind me. In the quiet hours before dawn, I heard faint sobbing. Once, I woke to find the basement door open, despite my certainty that I had locked it. I confided in my sister over the phone, hoping for reassurance. "Maybe you're just stressed," she suggested. "New house, new neighborhood. You're imagining things." I wanted to believe her. One night, the basement lights flickered on by themselves. I crept downstairs, flashlight in hand. The cold was biting. At the bottom of the stairs, I caught sight of a figure. A woman in a long dress, pale and translucent, standing by the furnace. She looked up, eyes hollow but full of sorrow. I stumbled backward, heart racing, and the apparition vanished. The next day, I found an old photo tucked in the attic. A black and white image of a young couple standing in front of a farmhouse. The woman bore a striking resemblance to the figure I had seen. On the back, in faded ink, was written, "Margaret and Thomas Gardner, 1943. Determined to understand, I reached out to a local historian who confirmed that the farmhouse had burned down in a fire in the late 1940s. Officially, it was an accident, but there were whispers of foul play, neighbors jealous or suspicious of Margaret's solitary life. I felt a pull to help her find peace. One evening, I lit candles and placed the photograph on the mantel. I spoke aloud, hoping to reach her spirit. "I don't know what you want or need, Margaret, but you don't have to be alone anymore." That night, the house was filled with an intense cold. I heard footsteps again, slow, measured, and a soft voice whispered, "Thank you." For a few nights, the disturbances ceased. Whiskers slept peacefully on the bed. The house felt lighter. Then, just as suddenly, the activity returned with a vengeance. Doors slammed with such force they shook the walls. Windows rattled despite closed locks. I found strange symbols etched faintly into the wood of the basement door, patterns I couldn't decipher. Whiskers would dart toward the basement stairs, growling fiercely. I contacted a medium, hoping for answers. She came prepared with sage and calming incantations. As she sat quietly in the living room, she became pale and distant. "There is a spirit here," she said, voice trembling. "She's bound by sorrow and anger, caught between worlds. She seeks justice for a wrong done long ago." The medium explained that Margaret's disappearance was not accidental. She was betrayed by those she trusted and suffered greatly in her final days. After the session, the medium advised that a ritual of release would be necessary, a way to help Margaret move on by acknowledging her pain and naming the truth aloud. I reached out to my neighbors and local historian, organizing a small gathering in the backyard under the oak tree. We lit candles and spoke the story of Margaret Gardner, honoring her life and the injustice she endured. That night, the house was eerily silent. The oppressive weight lifted, replaced by a strange calm. In the days that followed, the hauntings stopped. Whiskers explored every room without fear. I slept soundly for the first time in months. Though the neighborhood remained the same, quiet, normal, suburban, the house held a secret beneath its walls, a memory of grief, sorrow, and a spirit finally freed. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, I still feel a presence in the backyard, a gentle breeze carrying a faint lullaby, a reminder that some histories are never truly gone, only waiting to be told. Story the end.
Story number 5.
Moving into our new home on Ashwood Drive felt like the beginning of everything we'd wanted. After years spent hopping from apartment to apartment, my wife Lisa and I finally had a house with a yard in a quiet suburban neighborhood where the kids could play outside without worry. It was a typical street, rows of similar houses, well-kept lawns, kids riding bikes, neighbors waving from their porches. We were the newest residents, eager to make this place ours. The house itself was charming, but older than the others on the block. A 2-story built in the 1950s with hardwood floors and original woodwork. The previous owner was an elderly woman named Mrs. Benton, who had lived there alone for decades. Our real estate agent mentioned she had passed away not long before we bought the house, but no one else had shown interest in it since. At first, everything was perfect. The kids, Emily and Jake, made friends quickly, and Lisa and I settled into our routines. But it didn't take long before small, unsettling things started happening. It began with noises at night, soft footsteps in the hallway outside the kids' rooms, whispers too faint to understand, and occasional creaks that felt different from normal house settling. One night, I was jolted awake by the sound of the front door opening. I leapt out of bed and ran downstairs, only to find the door locked and the house empty. The kids were sound asleep. I dismissed it as a false alarm or a draft, until the next night when Lisa heard someone knocking on the window by the kitchen sink. "Maybe it's a neighbor," I said, but the street was empty and the porch light was off. No one was there. The strange occurrences grew more frequent. Emily complained that she saw an old woman sitting on the stairs in the dark. "She doesn't say anything," Emily said, eyes wide, "but she looks sad." Jake spoke of hearing a lullaby when he was alone in his room, a soft song that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Lisa and I tried to keep calm, chalking it up to the kids' imaginations. But I began staying up late, watching the hallways and corners, waiting for something to explain the eerie feeling settling over the house. One weekend, Lisa and I went to visit the local library, hoping to find out more about the house's history. The librarian was helpful and pulled out old records. It turned out Mrs. Benton's husband had died tragically in the house many years ago, a fall down the stairs during a winter storm. Mrs. Benton never remarried and was known to have grown more withdrawn after his death. Neighbors whispered that she still mourned him deeply, and some claimed she never truly left the house. Back home that evening, the atmosphere was thick. The kids were in bed, but Lisa and I both felt the unmistakable presence of someone else in the room. The lights flickered, then the thermostat dropped several degrees in a matter of minutes. On a whim, I called out softly, "Mrs. Benton, if you're here, we mean no harm." The response was a cold gust that swept through the living room, followed by a faint whisper that sounded like, "Help me." Sleep became impossible. One night, I heard Lisa crying quietly in the bathroom. When I asked her what was wrong, she whispered, "I saw her again, the woman on the stairs. She's asking for help." Desperate, I researched spiritual cleansings and contacted a local medium. She came the next day, walking through the house with candles and sage. Her expression grew grim as she explained the spirit was bound by grief and fear, unable to move on because of unresolved sorrow tied to her husband's death. We held a ceremony, reading aloud the old letters Mrs. Benton had kept in a dusty box in the attic. They were full of love and regret, apologies to a husband she could no longer protect. That night, the oppressive feeling lifted. The whispers stopped, the temperature normalized, and the house felt lighter, as if a burden had been lifted. Though the spirit's presence faded, the experience stayed with us, a reminder that some grief lingers longer than life. Years later, Ashwood Drive remains a peaceful street, but when the wind rustles the leaves just right, I still hear a faint lullaby on the breeze, soft, sad, and hopeful. Story, the end.
Story number 6.
The day I moved into the house on Maplewood Drive, the neighborhood looked like a postcard from a perfect suburban dream. Quiet streets lined with oak trees that filtered the afternoon sun in soft golden streams, kids riding bikes, sprinklers humming, neighbors chatting on their porches. It was exactly what I wanted after years of living in cramped city apartments, desperate for a fresh start. The house itself was modest but well cared for. A 2-story brick with a small front porch and a backyard big enough for a garden. I had bought it on a whim, drawn in by its charm and surprisingly low price for the area. The previous owners had left in a hurry, or so the realtor said. A young couple with a child, no explanation beyond that. The first few nights, everything was normal. I unpacked boxes, arranged furniture, and fell asleep to the quiet rhythm of a peaceful neighborhood. But soon, little things began to unsettle me. At first, it was just odd noises, footsteps in the hallway when I was alone, soft tapping on the window late at night. I told myself it was just the house settling, or maybe a raccoon on the roof. But then I started noticing things moving. The keys I'd set on the kitchen counter would be found on the floor, or a book on the living room table would be facing the wrong way. One evening, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard faint laughter coming from the basement. It was a high-pitched giggle, like a child's, but when I called out, there was only silence. The basement was cold and damp, filled with dusty boxes and old furniture left behind. I didn't want to go down there alone, but the laughter kept echoing in my mind. The next morning, I found a small toy, a worn-out teddy bear, lying on the floor at the base of the stairs. I was sure I hadn't brought it in. Curious and more than a little unnerved, I went to the local library to dig into the house's history. There, I found old newspaper clippings about a little girl named Emily who had lived in the house in the late 1970s. She had disappeared one rainy night and was never found. The case had gone cold, and the family eventually moved away. That evening, I sat on my porch with a cup of tea, staring at the dark windows of the house. A shadow flickered in the basement window, and I felt a chill crawl up my spine. Days passed with growing unease. At night, I'd wake up to soft whispers, sometimes calling my name. The air around me would grow inexplicably cold, and the feeling of being watched was constant. One night, I decided to confront whatever was there. I took a flashlight and descended the basement stairs slowly. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing old peeling wallpaper and stacked boxes. Suddenly, the flashlight flickered and went out. In the pitch black, I heard a soft voice whisper, "Help me." My heart pounded as I fumbled with the flashlight until it flickered back on. Across the room, I saw the faint outline of a little girl. She looked sad, her eyes wide and pleading. I asked her what she wanted. "Find me," she whispered. Determined, I began searching the basement for clues. Behind a loose panel in the wall, I discovered a small box filled with old photographs and letters. The letters were written by Emily, describing days filled with fear and loneliness, and warning about a man who had visited the house. The last letter stopped abruptly. I realized I was dealing with more than just restless spirits. There was a secret buried here, something dark and unresolved. That night, the house erupted with activity. Doors slammed, objects flew across rooms, and the temperature dropped so low that my breath fogged in the air. I stayed in my car, unable to go back inside until morning. I reached out to a local historian who specialized in the town's unsolved mysteries. She told me that there were rumors about a man who had been involved in Emily's disappearance, someone who had lived nearby and was never caught. The more I learned, the more I felt trapped in a web of sorrow and menace. The little girl's spirit wasn't just lost, it was warning me, begging for justice. I worked with the historian and the police, digging up old evidence that had been forgotten. Finally, after months of investigation, the truth came to light. The man responsible had long since passed, but the case was reopened and the community finally acknowledged what had been swept under the rug for decades. After the case was solved, the house grew quiet. The shadows no longer lingered in the corners and the cold spots vanished. One last time, I saw the little girl's outline in the basement, but this time she smiled softly before fading away. I stayed in the house for several more years, but I never forgot Emily or the way her spirit had reached out from the darkness. Sometimes, even in the quietest suburbs, the past refuses to stay buried. Story the end.
Story number 7.
Moving into the suburbs had always been our dream. A quiet street, manicured lawns, neighbors who smiled and waved as you walked by, and a house that promised a fresh start. After years in cramped apartments, my wife Amanda and I were thrilled to finally own a home with space for our 2 kids, Emily and Jack. The neighborhood seemed perfect. Families with kids, friendly faces, a community where life felt safe. But beneath the peaceful veneer, something was lurking, something we never expected. Our new house was built in the late 1950s, a single-story ranch style with a big backyard and an unfinished basement. We had a full inspection done before buying, and everything was clean. No structural problems, no pests, no red flags. The previous owners had lived there for decades, an elderly couple who moved to an assisted living facility. The real estate agent mentioned in passing that the house had character, but didn't elaborate. The first week was all excitement and exhaustion. Boxes everywhere, new schools for the kids, unpacking furniture, and trying to get settled. But it wasn't long before the oddities began. Emily was the first to notice. She was 7, sensitive and imaginative. One evening, while Amanda and I were cleaning the kitchen, Emily came in looking pale and quiet. "Mom, there's a lady in my room," she said softly. Amanda looked at her with concern. What lady, sweetie? The one who sings. She stands by my window at night and sings to me, but she's sad. She's been crying. We exchanged uneasy glances. Amanda reassured her it was probably just her imagination or the neighborhood sounds playing tricks on her. We didn't want to scare her, but then the knocking started. At first it was faint, a slow, rhythmic tap coming from the basement door late at night. I chalked it up to the house settling or maybe some animal outside. But the noise grew more persistent. One night I went down to check. The basement was dark and cold, filled with old boxes and an unused furnace. No one was there. I think it's the pipes, I told Amanda the next morning, though I wasn't convinced. The electrical lights in the hallway started flickering too. Not just once or twice, but regularly. The electrician confirmed the wiring was fine, which didn't help explain the erratic flickering. Amanda began hearing whispering voices when she was alone. Soft, unintelligible murmurs that stopped the moment she tried to listen carefully. One afternoon, while raking leaves in the backyard, I met Mr. Hargrove, our elderly neighbor who had lived on the street since before the neighborhood was built. He was a quiet man with a kind face, but when I asked about the house, his expression changed. "That place has a history," he said cautiously. "Before they built those houses, it was farmland. That land belonged to the Callahan family in the late 1800s. He paused, then continued in a lower voice. "There was a tragedy. A fire took most of the family. People say the mother never left the land. They say you can still hear her crying at night." I listened, intrigued but skeptical. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard it. A soft crying carried through the open window. I woke Amanda, but she heard nothing. The children became restless. Jack, usually a fearless 5-year-old, refused to enter the basement, clinging to Amanda whenever I went down there. Emily's drawings changed, filled with dark shapes and a woman with hollow eyes watching from the corner. One night, as the house settled and creaked, I awoke to a cold draft brushing my face. The hallway light flickered wildly. I sat up and saw a shadow move near the stairs, tall, thin, in old-fashioned clothes. Our eyes met for a moment before the figure faded into the darkness. I questioned my sanity. Amanda tried to comfort me, but we both knew something wasn't right. We decided to learn everything we could about the Callahan family. The town library held old newspapers and census records. The Callahans were a farming family. A man named Thomas, his wife Margaret, and their 2 children. In the harsh winter of 1883, a fire broke out in their farmhouse. Thomas and 1 child escaped, but Margaret and the younger child perished in the flames. Thomas moved away, never returning. The more we learned, the more the story seemed to match what we were experiencing. Margaret's spirit, trapped by grief and loss, clung to the land where she had lost everything. Amanda found a local woman who was a medium and asked for help. The medium came to the house one evening, carrying candles and sage. As she walked through the rooms, her face grew pale. "There is sorrow here, deep and heavy," she said. "The spirit is tethered by memories of loss and pain." The medium performed a cleansing ritual, chanting softly and waving incense. The air grew thick, the temperature dropped. A mournful sigh echoed through the walls. For days afterward, the strange phenomena lessened. The basement was quieter, the lights steadier. Emily slept peacefully for the first time in weeks, but the peace was fragile. One afternoon, the kids were playing outside when a sudden chill swept the yard. Emily screamed, pointing toward the far corner near the fence where a shadowy figure stood motionless, watching them. By the time I reached her, it was gone. That night, the crying returned, louder and more desperate. We realized Margaret's spirit was not angry, but trapped in her grief, longing to be remembered. We planted a small memorial in the backyard, near the spot where the farmhouse once stood, a cluster of wildflowers, a small wooden plaque with the Callahan name. One evening, as we sat on the porch, a gentle breeze carried a faint lullaby. Amanda smiled through tears. She's saying goodbye. The neighborhood returned to normal. The presence faded, but never completely left. Sometimes at night, I still hear a soft singing carried on the wind, a mother's sorrow echoing through time. Our suburban dream held a secret history, a story of loss and lingering love beneath its quiet streets. Story the end.
Story number 8.
It was late August when I finally moved into the little house on Cedar Street. After years of renting cramped apartments in the city, The idea of settling down in a quiet suburb was a welcome change. The neighborhood was typical, lined with two-story houses built in the 1970s, lawns neatly mowed, mailboxes adorned with plastic flowers, and streets where children still rode their bikes without helmets. It had the kind of calm that city dwellers crave. The house itself was nothing special, a modest beige clapboard with a dark green door and a small porch swing that creaked in the breeze. But it was mine. A fresh start. A new chapter. I moved in on a Sunday afternoon, unpacking boxes with the help of my younger sister Claire, who'd come to visit for a few days. "Looks cozy," she said, brushing her fingers over the dusty windowsill. "And quiet." "Too quiet, maybe," I joked. The first few days were uneventful. I worked from home, and during breaks, I watered the plants and sat on the porch with Max, my golden retriever. Max adjusted well. He loved the yard, chasing squirrels and barking at passing joggers. The neighbors were polite, some stopping to introduce themselves. An older couple across the street named the Harrisons, a young family next door with two noisy kids. It felt normal, but the normalcy didn't last. On the third night, I was awakened by the unmistakable sound of a door slamming. It was loud, sharp, echoing through the house. Max growled low in his throat, head raised, ears alert. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, straining to hear more. But the house was silent again. I convinced myself it was the wind or the old hinges on the back door, which I had yet to oil. When I checked, the door was securely locked. The following days brought more strange occurrences. Sometimes I'd hear soft footsteps on the hardwood floors, pacing slowly, then stopping right outside my bedroom door. When I opened it, nothing was there. At night, Max refused to sleep in the bedroom. Instead, he curled up by the foot of the stairs, staring into the darkness, growling occasionally. One afternoon, while unpacking in the basement, I noticed something odd. The old furnace in the corner rattled as if it had just kicked on, but the thermostat was set to off, and the house was comfortably warm. I bent down to check the pilot light. It was out. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A shadow slipping behind the furnace, too quick to be Max or a stray leaf blown in through the small window. I spun around. Nothing. That night, I told Claire about the noises and shadows. She looked skeptical, but offered to stay a few nights to keep me company. "Maybe it's just your imagination," she said as we sat on the porch swing under a sky thick with stars. "Maybe," I replied, but deep down I felt unsettled. The fourth night with Claire, the disturbances escalated. Around midnight, I woke to the smell of smoke. Not the kind from the fireplace or kitchen, but acrid and sharp. I sat up, coughing, trying to locate the source. The smoke seemed to fill the room. Claire stirred, whispering, "Do you smell that?" We both jumped out of bed and rushed downstairs. The living room was empty. No fire, no smoke. Suddenly, the ceiling light flickered violently and went out. The house was plunged into darkness. Max barked, frantic. We grabbed our phones for light and cautiously moved through the house. In the basement, the old furnace was glowing red, as if ignited, but there was no fire. I felt an intense heat, and the smell of smoke grew stronger. I tried to shut off the furnace, but controls were unresponsive. Then the basement door slammed shut upstairs, making us jump. Claire shouted, "Let's get out of here!" We raced up the stairs and out the front door into the cool night air. Once outside, the smell faded and the house went silent again. The next morning, I called a heating technician. He inspected the furnace and found it in perfect working order, with no signs of overheating or malfunction. "Maybe an electrical glitch," he suggested. "Old houses like this can be quirky." I wanted to believe that, but over the next few weeks, the phenomena worsened. Lights flickered randomly. Doors opened and closed without touch. Objects moved, books shifted on shelves, kitchen utensils disappeared and reappeared. Max would growl at empty corners, refusing to enter rooms alone. One night, I awoke to the sound of soft singing, a woman's voice, clear but distant, like a lullaby. It filled the hallway outside my bedroom. Max whimpered and tried to hide under the bed. I got up, heart racing, and followed the sound down the hall. It stopped abruptly at the guest room door, which was closed. The air was icy cold. I reached for the doorknob, hesitating before turning it. Inside, the room was empty, but for a rocking chair gently swaying as if someone had just left it. I slammed the door shut and locked it. The next day, I spoke with Mrs. Harrison, the neighbor. Have you noticed anything odd around here? I asked. She hesitated, then nodded. I've lived here since the 80s. That house has a history. What kind of history? She sighed. Before the subdivision was built, that land was part of a farm. The woman who lived there, Clara Benson, lost her husband and son in a fire. Some say she never left. Folks have heard crying, seen shadows. It's been whispered about for years. I asked if anyone had ever investigated or tried to help. No, just rumors and local stories. People avoid talking about it. That night, as I lay in bed, I found myself whispering, Clara, if you're here, what do you want? The house responded with silence at first. Then a sudden chill swept the room, and I felt a presence near the window. I turned slowly, catching a glimpse of a pale figure standing outside under the streetlight. Her dress fluttered in the breeze, and her eyes seemed full of sorrow. I blinked, and she was gone. Over the next few days, I searched for records about Clara Benson. I discovered that she had lived in the farmhouse with her husband and young son until the devastating fire that took their lives. Clara survived, but was never the same. Neighbors said she wandered the property, mourning until she disappeared without a trace. The house I lived in was built over what was once the Benson family land. One evening, I was alone in the kitchen when the lights flickered and the oven turned on by itself. The temperature rose quickly, and I smelled smoke again. I rushed to turn it off, but the controls were frozen. Suddenly, the oven door burst open, and a blast of cold air rushed out. The kitchen filled with an overwhelming sense of despair. Max growled and ran to the back door, scratching to go outside. Desperate, I reached out to a local medium, hoping to find peace for Clara's spirit. The medium came during a rainy afternoon, carrying incense and a calming presence. She closed her eyes and began to speak softly. There's pain here, she said. Clara's grief binds her to this place. She needs acknowledgement, a way to let go. She instructed me to hold a small ceremony in the backyard, honoring Clara's memory and the tragedy she endured. That night, I invited the neighbors. We lit candles and spoke gently of Clara, of the lives lost and the sorrow left behind. As we spoke, the air seemed to shift. A breeze whispered through the trees, carrying with it a faint melody, the lullaby I had heard. The house grew still. For the first time in weeks, Max slept through the night. The haunting diminished after that. The cold spots vanished, the shadows stopped appearing, and the house felt warm again. Still, sometimes at dusk, I catch the faint sound of singing carried on the wind, a reminder of a woman's love and loss etched into the soil beneath my feet. The suburb may look peaceful on the surface, but some stories linger in the quiet spaces between homes, waiting to be heard. Story the end.
Story number 9.
The first time I saw the house on Chestnut Avenue, it looked like any other suburban home. A modest 2-story with peeling white paint and an overgrown lawn that hadn't seen a mower in months. The neighborhood was the kind where kids rode bikes up and down the sidewalks during summer evenings, and neighbors exchanged waves during morning walks. My family had just moved from the city, desperate for a quieter life after my father's sudden death. The house was affordable, which was a relief, but it carried a weight in the way it sat there, quiet, worn, and forgotten. We moved in late October, just as the days grew shorter and the chill started creeping in. My mother tried to put a brave face on it for my sister and me, but the strain was visible in her tired eyes. The house wasn't in great shape. The furnace needed repair, the windows rattled, and the hardwood floors creaked under every step. But it was ours, and that was enough. At first, everything seemed normal. We spent the first week unpacking and cleaning, trying to make the place feel like home. But as the nights grew longer, small things began to unsettle me. It was subtle at first, an inexplicable cold spot in the hallway, the faint sound of footsteps when no one else was home, a soft whisper that seemed just beyond hearing. One night I woke to the sound of the front door creaking open. Heart pounding, I slipped out of bed and saw the old door swinging gently in the night breeze. I closed it quietly, locking it again, and went back to bed telling myself it was just the wind. But something about that night felt wrong, like the house had breathed and moved in ways it shouldn't. My sister Jenna was harder to reassure. She swore she saw a woman standing at the foot of her bed, a pale figure in a faded dress, her eyes empty and dark. Jenna refused to sleep alone after that, for clinging to me in the nights that followed. My mother grew worried, but refused to talk about it openly, brushing it off as stress and the result of the move. During the day, the neighborhood seemed peaceful, almost deceptively so. The neighbors were polite but distant, quick with smiles but guarded in conversation. One afternoon, while walking our dog, I met an elderly man named Mr. Peters. He warned me gently, "That house, it's not like the others. Been trouble there for years." I pressed him for details. "What kind of trouble?" He hesitated before speaking. "Old family drama, a man who died suddenly, and some say his spirit never left. Folks say the house carries his sorrow." That night, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I stayed up late, the house silent except for the ticking clock and the occasional groan of settling wood. Then, from the basement, came a soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingers drumming on a wooden table. I grabbed a flashlight and crept down the stairs, but found nothing. The air was cold, and my breath fogged in the beam of light. Days passed, and the incidents grew worse. Doors slammed shut on their own, lights flickered despite new bulbs, and the whispers grew louder, sometimes sounding like a mournful song. Jenna stopped speaking about the woman but cried at night, trembling as if unseen hands touched her. One evening, my mother found an old photograph tucked behind a loose panel in the living room wall. It showed a stern-looking man with deep eyes standing in front of the house decades earlier. On the back was a date, 1932, and a name, Thomas Caldwell. Research revealed that Thomas Caldwell was the previous owner who had died tragically in the house during the Great Depression. The story went that he was a hard-working man who struggled to provide for his family and had passed away suddenly after a mysterious illness. That night, the atmosphere changed. Shadows seemed to crawl along the walls, and I heard a voice whisper my name, soft but urgent. I followed the sound into the basement, where the cold was unbearable. In the dim light, I saw a faint figure near the far corner, vague, shimmering, and sorrowful. "I'm sorry," the voice said, breaking the silence. I didn't mean to. I froze, heart racing, unsure whether to flee or speak. The apparition vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving behind a weight in the air. We called in a local medium, who came to the house and sensed a restless spirit tied to pain and regret. She explained that Thomas Caldwell's soul lingered, bound by unfinished business and sorrow over a loss that had never been fully faced. Over the next weeks, we worked to bring peace to the house, holding ceremonies, reading old letters found in the attic, and speaking aloud our forgiveness. Slowly, the house's oppressive energy lifted. The shadows receded, the cold spots disappeared, and Jenna began to sleep peacefully again. Years later, the house on Chestnut Avenue stands quiet and calm. The neighborhood's children still play in the streets, and neighbors smile warmly. But sometimes, when the wind rustles through the autumn leaves, I swear I hear the soft tapping of fingers, a faint whisper carried on the breeze, a reminder that some stories never truly end. Story the end.
Story number 10.
Moving to the suburbs was supposed to be the fresh start my family needed. After years of cramped apartments and noisy city streets, the idea of a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood felt like a dream come true. We found a nice, older house on Willow Lane, nestled between maple trees and well-manicured lawns. The kind of street where neighbors wave when they see each other and kids play outside until dusk. The first few weeks were blissfully normal. My wife, Laura, and I settled in with our 2 children, Ben and Emily. The house was charming, with creaky hardwood floors and a fireplace that promised cozy winters. The neighbors seemed friendly enough, especially Mrs. Langston, who lived next door. She was an elderly woman with a kind smile and a penchant for baking cookies, which she frequently shared. It wasn't long before the first strange thing happened. One night, I was working late in the home office when I heard the faint sound of a music box playing from the hallway. It was soft, almost delicate, like the kind of lullaby you'd hear in an old nursery. The house was supposed to be empty except for us. I checked the rooms. No one was awake except me. Ben and Emily were fast asleep in their rooms. I dismissed it as my imagination, maybe the wind rattling something in the attic, but the sound lingered in my mind. The next morning, I asked Laura if she'd heard anything. She looked uneasy, but said no. Over the next few days, the occurrences grew harder to ignore. Doors I was sure I'd closed were found open. Lights flickered without explanation. Ben told us he sometimes saw a lady in white standing by his window at night, but when he looked again, she was gone. We tried to brush it off. New house, new routines, maybe some anxiety from the kids adjusting to school and new surroundings. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. One evening, Laura came to me, pale and trembling. "I saw her," she said quietly. The lady in white. She was standing at the foot of the stairs. She looked sad, and she was crying. I wanted to reassure her, but deep down I felt the same chill in the air she described. That night I decided to do some digging. I visited the local library and combed through archives and property records. The house had been built in the early 1960s, part of the post-war boom in suburban developments. Nothing unusual there. But when I looked up old newspapers, I found a story that caught my eye. A young woman named Margaret Hensley had lived in the house in the late 1960s. She was 25 when she died under tragic circumstances. The article said she had been found at the bottom of the basement stairs, the victim of an accidental fall. Some neighbors believed she had been despondent after a difficult breakup. There were whispers of depression and isolation, but nothing definitive. Margaret's family had moved away shortly after her death, and the house had changed hands several times since. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. Could the woman we were seeing be Margaret? Was her spirit still lingering, trapped in sorrow? The next few nights were a torment of unsettling experiences. The music box played more often. Footsteps echoed when the house was empty. I caught glimpses of a pale figure in the shadows. Laura began having nightmares of a woman crying silently in the dark. One night I woke to find the basement door ajar. I never kept it unlocked. I stepped inside, flashlight in hand, the beam cutting through thick darkness. The basement smelled musty, the air heavy and cold. As I descended the stairs, a sudden chill ran through me, and the faint sound of sobbing echoed off the walls. At the foot of the stairs, I saw it. A small music box resting on an old workbench, inexplicably playing on its own. I reached out to touch it, and the crying stopped abruptly. That night, I dreamed of Margaret. She was standing in the basement, her eyes haunted but pleading. She spoke without words, reaching out to me as if begging for help. I knew then we had to find out more. I contacted the current neighbors who had lived on Willow Lane the longest. Mrs. Langston was hesitant at first, but it eventually told me stories she'd heard from previous residents. Some claimed Margaret had been lonely, trapped in that house by grief and despair. Others whispered that the basement was a place of secrets, that Margaret's death might not have been an accident. Fueled by these stories, I began searching the basement more thoroughly. Behind a loose panel in the wall, I discovered a small box containing letters and photographs. The letters were written by Margaret, addressed to no one in particular, filled with sorrow and fear. She wrote of a man who had visited the house and caused her great distress. I felt a shiver as I read. The final letter was unfinished, trailing off mid-sentence. Determined to get to the truth, I reached out to the local police archives. After some persistence, I obtained reports hinting that Margaret's death had been investigated as a possible homicide, but the case had gone cold for lack of evidence. That night, the house's atmosphere shifted dramatically. Shadows seemed to crawl along the walls, and the temperature dropped sharply. I felt eyes watching me from every corner. Laura and the kids huddled together, frightened. Suddenly, a heavy weight pressed down on my chest. The apparition of Margaret appeared before me, her expression one of anguish and desperation. She reached out, silently pleading for justice. I promised to find the truth and bring her peace. Over the next months, I worked with a local historian and detectives to reopen the cold case. We uncovered forgotten witnesses and pieced together a story of abuse and betrayal that had been hidden beneath the town's surface. Eventually, a man, long deceased, was named as responsible for Margaret's death. His dark history had been covered up to protect powerful community members. Our efforts brought closure to the case, and the town began to reckon with its buried secrets. After the truth came out, the disturbances in the house faded. The music box stopped playing on its own. The footsteps ceased. Margaret's figure appeared one last time by the basement stairs, her eyes peaceful and grateful. Then she was gone. We stayed in the house for several years afterward, but the atmosphere had changed. The sorrow that had hung like a cloud lifted, replaced by a quiet calm. Sometimes, though, when the wind rustles through the maple leaves on Willow Lane, I still feel a soft presence near the stairs, a gentle reminder of the woman who waited too long to be heard. Story the end.